Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week is Susan Glasser, staff writer for The New Yorker. Susan, wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Also with us is Stephen Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe for The New York Times. Steve, wonderful to have you.
Great to be here virtually.
And Philip Stevens, who is the chair of the editorial board and chief political commentator of the Financial Times. Philip, wonderful to have you back once again. Lots of things to talk about. Let's start with the fact that, in fact, right now, as we speak, President Biden is about to address the Munich Security Conference, something that I've long called the Oscar for security policy wonks. It's where everyone who cares about security policy gets together. I guess this time it's virtual, but it is the latest in a string of multilateral engagements, Susan, by the Biden administration, coming after a G7 heads of state meeting this morning, virtually, and a bunch of others that the Secretary of State, Biden himself, the Vice President, John Kerry, and others have been engaging in. And you really see this movement of, we want to work with our allies and friends around the world to address the problems. How is this playing out abroad, and what beyond meeting can we expect from all of this, Susan?
Well, thank you, Ivo. It's so great to be with you and everybody today. I have to say, it's America is back Friday is the theme of the day, right? You have the G7, as you mentioned this morning. You have Biden and the Munich Security Conference. Today is the official day also that the US returns to the Paris Climate Accord. You have news related to all of the above about the US and whether it's going to get together with its European partners and try to resume conversations with Iran over the Iran nuclear deal. You have not only the President Biden, but also his key officials, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, joining conversations with their international counterparts, some of their first big appearances on this virtual global stage. So, it's multilateralism day, but I think it's in the context of America is back day. Now, the truth is that this is the easy part, right? Getting the optics right isn't hard when your predecessor basically said, screw you to all of these organizations. And so just the sigh of relief is a continued sense of just, great, they're going to show up and they're not going to spit in the soup. And so, again, this is the easy part for any new administration to get right coming after the last few years. I'm particularly thinking this morning of the G7 conversation that Biden participated in, the first one since he became the president almost just exactly a month ago. It was only last fall that and last June, that Donald Trump was supposed to be the host of the G7 and was trying to get world leaders to come here to Washington in the middle of the pandemic, knowing that he would not obey safety protocols. Angela Merkel had to literally refuse to come and meet with the President of the United States and tank that final abortive effort of Trump to sort of commandeer the world stage on his own behalf. So obviously it's a very, very different moment in terms of the look and feel of these institutions. And, I think the administration, these are veterans, but that may also make them cautious in the sense that they're invested to a certain extent in what the status quo ante was, right? And so to me, I think what you're seeing them do, it makes sense, is to, in fact, restart the machinery of the US-European partnership on some of these global issues. In particular, we'll see that with Iran at first. I think you'll see that as a big theme of the climate negotiations as well on the front end. How far will that get them? I think is an interesting question. And we can talk more about that this hour, but certainly today is a big day in the America is back stage of the Biden administration.
Steve, to take it from here, particularly those last two observations that Susan made, that This Is America is back day, no doubt, but back to do what? And how are they being received as they come back?
It's Build Back Better Friday, or Multilateral Friday. No, I mean, Susan summarized it really, really well. Today, frankly, is all about gestures. It's all about symbolism. It is starting the machinery. I mean, these engines have been pretty locked up for a long time. There's a lot of oil that needs to be sprayed and antifreeze and so on. And, the Europeans will welcome Biden, who is an old friend. I mean, it's like a warm bath for them, right? I mean, it's very comfortable, but there's enormous wariness. There is. It's not just Biden's age. It's not just that a Trump-like Republican Party looms over the next 4 years from now. It's also that they think the Biden people haven't understood the world has changed. And maybe they have, but they've seen no real indication of it. And they, I was very struck. We try to do a story today looking forward to this Munich thing, when Emmanuel Macron gave a big interview the same day Biden spoke at the State Department, which was his previous foreign policy thing. Macron was remarkably unwelcoming. I mean, he didn't say anything about how wonderful the transatlantic alliance was and how happy he was that Biden was back. He was basically warning, I mean, to some degree, he's anxious about this, but warning his European colleagues not to get too comfortable, that we have our own interests, that, we don't want to be, I keep saying, the junior pilot to the American fighter jet aimed at Russia, aimed at China. They have their own interests. And Macron wants them to defend them. And I find Merkel being a bit wary too. She wants to negotiate Nord Stream. We can talk more about this sort of famous or infamous pipeline. And I think the Biden people want to do it too, because Germany matters and they want a new relationship and they want to get over the real grit that's still in the gas line of the old engine. And that's Nord Stream, it's Airbus, Boeing, tariffs, it's fighting about China and Huawei. So I think, and it's Iran. So I mean, clearing away this stuff, I think is really important. I mean, I think Iran's very important. They got a big ride yesterday, maybe too big a ride, from simply a willingness to have a conversation in the context of the JCPOA. They're still not very clear how they're going to sequence getting back to the JCPOA, but it made the Europeans very, very happy. And the EU, which is the convener of these talks, is very eager to get them going again. And they're hoping Iran will show up. I think it probably will. But then, as Susan said, the hard work begins. I'll stop there.
So let's jump in here and talk a little bit about how, beyond the warm bath, Europe is thinking about working together with the Biden administration. I note that Macron gave another interview in your paper today, a big interview in which he pushed as hard as he has ever done on strategic autonomy and European sovereignty, making clear it's not against the United States, but it's time for Europe to stand on its own 2 feet, which people in Washington always say, well, the 2 feet are going to walk in a different direction than we want to do it. So how do you see this, Philip?
Well, on that point precisely, I think you Americans and we Brits get too wrapped up in French, or too wound up by French rhetoric. Look, Macron is, heir to Charles de Gaulle. He's always going to talk about, European autonomy, French independence, making our own choices. Actually, I think if you look at France's record, it's a pretty reliable ally, to the US. When, Obama a few years ago was thinking about bombing Syria, which country had its jets with the engines running, ready to go with him? So I think if you look at what's happening in the Maghreb, with French and American forces in the Sahel, sorry, not the Maghreb, in the Sahel, French and American forces working together. So I think you aim off a little bit. Macron wants to be able to say that, Europe has an independent voice, but he knows very well that, the French, the Europeans can't really operate without the alliance with the Americans. I think by contrast, you get all the right words from Berlin, and Mrs. Merkel talking about multilateralism, the rules-based system. But when it comes to the hard choices, whether it's over China or Russia or even within the EU over Hungary, what comes first is German industry and German business. So in a sort of strange way, I think the tougher sort of negotiation is going to be with Germany, because when it comes down to it, and I thought Susan's metaphor of getting the machinery going was an excellent one. When it comes down to it, for this machinery to produce anything, everyone's going to have to make compromises. The Germans are going to have to make compromises about their exports and their business. The French are going to have to make some compromises about how it looks. And the Americans are going to have to make some compromises about trade and other things. So I think the big test of all this is going to be not actually it's going to be Iran or climate change. I think the big test is whether there are these trade disputes between the US and the EU. Some of them going back, 15 years, Airbus and Boeing and whatever. Now, it seems to me, if these people are serious about multilateralism, they've got to sort out their own problems. You can't talk about reforming the World Trade Organization if you're imposing sanctions on each other over, bilateral trade disputes. So I think there's a lot of goodwill, but I think, the next few months are going to be pretty gritty, and we'll see who will show the political leadership to get some movement on some of these really quite difficult, long-standing problems and issues as well, like technology and taxation of the big tech companies. These are difficult things which affect people's livelihoods, and you can't get the big stories like climate change right unless you actually get your own houses in order, I think.
Susan, on this form over substance issue, which it really is, the substance is the next big piece. Iran seems to be the area where there is the move to try to, the form is right. We got it. The JCPOA parties are supposed to come together. I think Steve's probably right that the Iranians will show up. But then what? Now you're at your meeting. How are we going to move this one forward? Do you have a sense that the administration has a strategy?
No, actually, I have the opposite sense, actually, which is that they don't have a strategy. And, I've been very struck, actually, in, hearing from very senior officials in the new government that they aren't really sure. First of all, they are actually at an impasse on the front end with Iran, because their two publicly stated views are actually incompatible with having talks, because the Iranians have said very clearly and reiterated it again yesterday that they will not be doing anything until sanctions are lifted on the front end. And the US has said also publicly they will not be prepared to do anything unless Iran returns to full compliance first with the JCPOA. And so I think there was a little bit of, we have to test the Iranians and figure out, do they really mean this? And if that is the case, then we're going to have to look for some other way forward. Now, I did see today something that suggested to me that creative problem solvers are already at work. And this is something that was used back in the original iteration of the Iranian nuclear deal in the talks, which was the idea, okay, well, neither would concede in advance, but perhaps they could set a mutually agreed upon date by which there was progress on this. And I do think in that sense, it is important messaging the idea that the Europeans are going to be the vehicle and the conveners and the host of returning this deal. to something, because I think that sends an important message. To Philip's point, I agree that the bigger, much more difficult issue with Europe, as kind of with Republicans on Capitol Hill here in the United States, it's a very similar issue, which is to say, who can be against unity? Who can be against working together, right? Nobody's against that, especially everyone at this moment is in favor of turning the temperature down from the harsh rhetoric of the Trump era. But that requires people to do things that are uncomfortable. And for Europeans, it's a lot easier to bash Donald Trump and to feel that you are an aggrieved victim, because in fact you are, than it is to actually make what might be seen as preemptive, painful concessions. And the truth is that many of the issues and sticking points between the United States and Europe, whether it's on trade issues or, for example, on NATO, you know this better than I do, predate the Trump administration. And, my fear is that the takeaways here could actually be quite damaging once we get beyond the positive optics. For example, what if the takeaway that we all have after 2 years is actually bullying and hectoring is more effective, or Europe is more inclined to knuckle under to that than it is to quote unquote working together. So that's one fear. And then of course, America has a big reputational problem at this moment, which is to say, why make any negotiations with the United States, with the Biden administration, no matter how well disposed, if the US is simply going to change political horses again in 2 or 4 years? What's the point? And, of dealing with a superpower whose word is not good on the international stage?
Steve, I think this is a great segue to the next issue, which has been with us now for 20 plus years, Afghanistan, and a real issue both for the United States about what it is that it needs to do, because the Trump administration laid a pathway towards exit, but also how do you work with allies? A big issue, I guess, yesterday in the defense ministerial at NATO. Americans don't know, but Europeans do. There are plenty more troops from NATO countries than there are American troops in Afghanistan. And the question of how that issue that is so beset the alliance and our relationship is going to be resolved is right at the front of our discussion right now.
That is absolutely right. This is one of the great forever wars, and there are no great options. I mean, Joe Biden's wanted to get out for quite a long time, I think, and I think he's finding it almost impossible. This was another one of these warm baths, in the sense that the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, done virtually, obviously, but said all the right things and talked about NATO and how wonderful it was and collective defense and we're all with you, and everybody loved that. But actually, people are quite angry about Afghanistan. I mean, May 1 is the deadline under the peace talks. And they don't know what the Americans want, and they can't do anything until the Americans decide, and it's all under review. So on one hand, it's a great pretext not to decide, but on the other hand, people are feeling way out there. They feel very vulnerable. And people tell me that, frankly, at this stage of troop work, there's very little anybody's doing in Afghanistan except protecting themselves. They're sort of down at troop levels that really are about force protection. And they rely on the Americans. They can't protect themselves without the Americans, even though the Americans are fewer in number. So the Germans, who have a lot of troops out there, the Dutch, they're feeling really exposed in this interim. And of course, the Taliban's not playing along. The Taliban's not doing what it said it was going to do. It is attacking cities. The peace talks are way behind schedule. So my guess is May 1 will get delayed. And then, the question is, delayed for how long and delayed for what exactly? And then, of course, the great fear everyone has is, if you leave and the Taliban takes over, who gets the blame, right? This is really one of those awful, awful dilemmas, and somebody's going to have to suck it up and make a decision. But as usual, Not yet, O Lord, please, not yet.
It seems right, Philip. It seems to, because all the choices are bad, not making a choice is the only good option left is kind of what you have. But
this is the Vietnam dilemma, isn't it?
It is, and of course,
50 odd years ago, how do you, the war's been lost. How do you admit it's been lost, or how do you leave without admitting that it's been lost? And as Steve said, the Taliban has, in their famous phrase, we've got the time. You may have the troops, but we've got the time, and they can just sit it out, and we're going to leave. And I don't know. I mean, I'm in that group who says, if we're going to do this, horrible though it is, we should do it and leave. And
leave. As NATO has said, in together, out together, all together at the same time. I guess the question, Susan, is this a decision that basically Washington needs to make and everybody will follow? This is the one where they're happy to take for the U.S. to take the lead, or is this where they really want to sit down and have a deep discussion with the Americans about the strategy to war event? If you were to put yourself in a European prime minister, foreign minister, defense minister shoes, how would you approach this?
Well, I can see where you're leaning, in the framing that question, which is certainly the former and not the latter. This has been an American problem. Largely, it's had a key partnership with allies, and I was struck, I must say, by the fact that you have even European diplomats and civilian leaders saying, "Hey, wait a minute, strikes us as too ill-conceived or hasty, and we need to, see about extending it." It's really an example of something that, because of the extreme dysfunction and political chaos inside the United States over the last year, that's gotten much less attention than it would have otherwise. The fact is that there was almost no transparency around what Mike Pompeo and the U.S. Secretary of State and his diplomats were doing with regards to making this kind of a deal with the Taliban. And, once Trump's kind of national security machinery imploded and John Bolton walked out, who would have been a break on such an arrangement, essentially they were given a free hand. Nobody really paid attention, including, as far as I can tell, the president of the United States. And so, who simply wanted to wave a piece of paper and say, "I'm a peacemaker, I got your troops out." And you had this extraordinary spectacle, in fact, after the US presidential election. I mention this because it's really amazing. I think people don't realize this, where basically the president, fired the Pentagon chief, Mark Esper, the day after the US presidential election, and overruled the military. No process, just essentially said, "Bring them home now. I don't care, whatever." Obviously, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in superpower decision making. The flip side is, I talked with even a lot of Republicans who were skeptical or upset about that move, who said it might have been a gift to Joe Biden. And, Steve is correct. Joe Biden has been wary, understandably, for many, many years of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. He certainly isn't going to want to be the guy who stood it back up after Donald Trump lowered it. So I think we're leaving, and the question is really, are there going to be slightly different or tweaked terms to the arrangement, frankly?
So, this would be a good question for a pub quiz. How long after the Soviet troops left Kabul did their puppet government survive?
I know the answer, right?
I bet you do.
It's 2 years. It wasn't right away, is the interesting answer. No. And, it was in 1989 that Boris Gromov, who was the last Soviet commanding general, marched across the famous Friendship Bridge back into Uzbekistan, in Termez. Uzbekistan, and that was in 1989, and it was a sort of a harbinger of the breakup of the Soviet Union that was yet to come. But it actually wasn't until after the breakup of the Soviet Union that the Najibullah government fell, and you had the beginning of this cycle of violence and the destruction of Kabul that led ultimately to the rise of the Taliban.
Of course, Joe Biden came of age as a young senator, watching helicopters taking off of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, and not sure that he wants to see the same kind of pictures while he is president of the United States happening in the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. And yet, given the situation on the ground, the likelihood of an ignominious exit is higher than before. A tough issue, many tough issues. And Philip, let me go to another tough issue. In this case, it's a tough friend, a tough ally, Turkey. Lots of things happen inside Turkey. A lot of things that the Turks are doing. The U.S.-Turkey relationship is in the deep freeze. So is the EU-Turkish relationship, and yet it is that major country that sits between Europe and Asia, between the Middle East, as a Muslim state, with an overwhelmingly Muslim population. Put it in those terms, a critical partner in so much of what we do. How is this relationship evolving, and where do you see it going?
Well, as you say, the US has got a big problem with Turkey. In fact, it's got two big problems in that part of the world, both with allies. One is with Saudi Arabia, and the other is with Turkey. And this week we've seen President Erdogan lash out against Washington again because of the murder, the killing of Turkish military personnel by the PKK, the Kurdish fighters in northern Iraq. These were held hostages, and the Turkish military launched an operation, and they were shot, as far as one can see, pretty brutally. 13 of them, I think. And these are affiliated to the Kurdish fighters in Syria, with whom the Americans have been fighting to defeat the Islamists. And so you had a resumption of this tension, this really quite, where Turkey basically says the United States is supporting terrorists, or the close allies of terrorists. But to be honest, Turkey, 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, Turkey had a foreign policy which was stated of no problems with neighbors. It was going to be friendly with everyone. It now has problems with every single neighbor, and it's moved in and out, and it's been close to Russia. It's got problems now with Russia. It's on opposite sides in Libya, opposite sides in Azerbaijan, and its fight with Armenia. It's pulled back from Europe, but Erdogan has serious economic problems at home, real pressure on the lira, and he relies on trade with the West. So you have this rather strange Jekyll and Hyde figure in Turkey, in the this vast presidential palace he's built for himself. Now, on the one hand, decrying the US and decrying Europe, and on the other hand, saying, I want to move the country back to the West, as it were. And that, in Europe, his principal interlocutor, and this is another area, I think, where Merkel is sort of rather softer than Macron. His principal interlocutor is Merkel, who's trying to calm things down. Macron is supporting Greece, and another set of disputes that Turkey has in the Aegean Sea with Greece. And it's very difficult there are even more disputes about Turkey's purchase of very sophisticated Russian anti-air missiles. It's very difficult how you unpick all these different threads and come through with a set of agreements or a set of understandings with someone like Erdogan that's sustainable over more than a period of a month or 2 or 3. So I'm not sure I'm not sure I think if the administration doesn't have a policy on Afghanistan, I'm not sure it has a policy on Turkey yet. but I'm not sure there is a particularly, there's not an easy route here. I think everyone wants to calm things down, and there is a ceasefire in theory in Libya, and Merkel has been trying to keep the lid on the conflict between Greece and Turkey in the Aegean. But Erdogan is a very unpredictable leader. He's one of these, quote, strong men, and he thinks when things get tough at home, he can sometimes, raise the spectre of the foreign enemy to get the nationalists on his side. So I'm not sure there's an easy way out. This is where, your old profession, diplomacy, is going to have to earn its stripes, as it were.
Steve, this is the problem that everybody wants to go away, but it never goes away. And muddling through seems to be by the way, the way that diplomacy and diplomats figure out how to deal with problems like this is by not dealing with them or muddling through. That's the essence of diplomacy. Is this muddle throughable, or is it actually time for someone to take the reins and say, we need to have a united policy on Turkey and figuring out how to deal with it?
Well, managing Turkey, could be the title of a dissertation. It is really important. I mean, let's remember, it's a really crucial part of NATO. It doesn't want to leave NATO. It annoys a lot of its fellow NATO members, but the southern flank is exposed, the Black Sea is exposed, Russia's there. Turkey is hosting millions of refugees, millions of mostly Syrian, but also Afghan refugees, Muslim refugees, doing so at great cost, though it's being to some degree subsidized by the European Union, which is paying it off to keep these people away from Europe, right? So it has all kinds of leverage that Erdogan uses from time to time. I do think this administration, it's early days yet, but the people that I know in it who are dealing with Turkey are pretty hard-nosed about Turkey. Trump loved Erdogan. That was part of the problem. There was a kind of policy toward Turkey, but, Trump loved him anyway. And they'd talk a lot on the phone, often without note takers. And if you remember, there was this way, it was a scandal. It really made Macron furious when Trump just promised Erdogan he'd pull troops out of Northern Syria. It was absurd. And then, of course, then they had to go around Trump, the Pentagon people, to make sure a few stayed behind. But that won't happen now. I think there's a much tougher unified line, which but Erdogan understands. Erdogan, as Philip says, is sliding back to try to get into good graces with the Biden people, a bit of a reset. And that's pretty clear at NATO, for instance. In the Eastern Mediterranean, where they've had these issues with Greece, they have vowed, Turkey, they are in talks. They're in military deconfliction talks inside NATO with the Greeks and the French, so they don't shoot at each other, which they came very close to doing earlier this summer. But they're also in beginning talks about energy borders, which is maybe time delaying, but is better than, fighting. And there's also a kind of, how would I put this, a sense inside NATO that Erdogan has promised not to send his survey ship, the Auric Rice, which is looking for gas into disputed waters. So every time he does that, it creates a real possibility for violence. So he's backed off from those things. But managing Turkey, managing the S-400 problem is really hard. And I do think, it's possible. I'm sure there are talks that will continue. There are all kinds of ways to mothball them or this or that. But I think there's no easy answer. And also we have to remember Erdogan, he's much more vulnerable than he was 5 years ago. Turkey's politically much more split. And as Philip said, the economy is more in trouble and it's deeply dependent on European trade, right? So Managing it, great. Keep them from fighting each other, great. Frankly, you can argue in Libya, they actually probably did a good thing. And if the ceasefire holds, all for the better. And certainly in Syria, it's the Turks that are keeping Idlib alive. I mean, otherwise Assad and the Russians would have flattened it. So, you know, it's a balance. I mean, Turkey's not evil in every instance, and in some ways it's doing, as Turks argue, the West's work for it without getting much credit for it.
There is one
Yeah,
early decision that the Biden administration has to make, which is about the military sanctions, because although Trump liked Erdogan, in the end he imposed military sanctions, which has cut the Turkish military off from US technology and advanced weaponry. And that's the sort of, now what does Biden do? And that's going to be, I think, quite a hard choice early on for Biden.
Susan, just to jump in here quickly. I mean, this seems to me another one of those examples in which realpolitik, which says you need to make deals, is clashing with the liberal instinct of this administration, which puts democracy and human rights first and foremost in its approach, and opposes strongman. Balancing those two, you know, is happening everywhere, but it seems to me on Turkey is particularly difficult for the administration.
You know, I think that's an excellent observation, Ivo, especially because we haven't talked, we sort of talked around it, but the bigger question right now that will, I think, in part determine a little bit what you ultimately see from the Biden administration when it comes to Turkey is Russia. And in the end, as Steve pointed out, you know, Turkey has been on every side of the Russia issue in the last few years, and it, you know, continues to have sanctions as a result of its purchase of the S-400 from Russia. But you know, that to me remains, I think, an extremely open question here in Washington, which is you see a lot tougher rhetoric, understandably, from the president than from the previous president when it comes to Vladimir Putin. But what is in their toolkit besides endless rounds of sanctions? And so that's where you might start to see some new kinds of pressure tactics and more coercive diplomacy that certainly could involve Turkey, among other things. It could involve Nord Stream, which we talked about. So one interesting question is, you've seen both the Obama and the Trump administrations, for example, complaining to Germany about Nord Stream, but not necessarily really putting the squeeze on. If Europe is actually going to be a different kind of partner for the Biden administration, if they really were scared into a new relationship by the excesses of the Trump era, that would be an example of something that would be different than just essentially endless rounds of sanctions. To the point about what can the administration do with Turkey, I think Steve is right about Syria and the other work that Turkey has been doing, in effect, on behalf of the West, even if Europe isn't happy with the how often of how they've been doing things. And there is zero appetite, and I repeat, zero appetite in Washington and with this new team of folks to be pulled back in to security messes in the Middle East, such as Syria, especially with them trying to revive the prospects of a diplomatic dealings with Iran. And so once again, Turkey is a crucial player in all of that. And I think you're right. But there is no love lost. And remember, it was Barack Obama and Joe Biden at his side as vice president who felt very taken in and very misled by Erdogan, with whom Obama started out on very cordial terms until he realized that he had completely misunderstood and misrepresented, just didn't get what was going on in Turkey. And so I think that, they're not going to make that mistake again.
Stephen, just in the few minutes left on Russia, to building on what Susan just said, and the Biden administration is coming in with a different approach towards Russia than any other administration in the Cold War period. They want to have a much tougher approach than their predecessors, but they also believe it's important to get the allies together on that policy. And the allies aren't necessarily with the United States when it comes to a tougher policy towards Russia. And that's particularly true for Germany. And it's particularly true because, that one thing that has been besetting the relationship between the United States and Germany, Nord Stream, the gas pipeline that goes through the Baltic Sea directly to Germany, is making it difficult. There are rumors and talks about trying to figure out a way to resolve that so that we can unify the policy towards Russia. What are you hearing about this?
Well, it is important to understand that in this case, Europe is really, it's not just confused, it's divided, right? I mean, it's saying the obvious, but it's sometimes worth reminding people that there is no such thing as this Europe, right? I mean, the Poles, the Baltic states, I mean, they love Donald Trump. It wasn't just for Trump, but I mean, the sense that, he was going to stand up against Russia despite his friendship with Putin. The Germans have always had this relationship with Russia, which is partly cultural, partly historical, partly trade, and partly guilt over the war, right? Which President Steinmeier was talking about as an excuse for Nord Stream 2 the other day. It was quite annoying the Ukrainians, who said, we lost more people to you guys than the Russians did. But of course, it was all one Soviet Union then. And then, the French too. Macron really sees Russia as a neighbor, a truculent neighbor, a nuclear neighbor, but doesn't, want to get pushed into an American, sounds like a Biden anti-authoritarian campaign that treats Russia and China similarly. And a lot of Europeans don't want to do that. It's just different. But then what happened, of course, with Navalny, the EU foreign policy chief, who doesn't have much power, Joseph Borrell, for some reason, and again, many Europeans told him not to go, went to Moscow to look for a new relationship, I think more on the Macron side, and got humiliated by Lavrov, who has a heart of ash and coal, but is a wonderful diplomat. And Lavrov ate his lunch, and poor Borrell went away really quite embarrassed, and the Europeans were embarrassed. Now they can't say so because it undermines Borrell and helps the Russians. But it does make it more likely that by the end of March, there'll be new European sanctions on Russia based on Navalny. But again, they have to be careful because they can't just sanction the oligarchs who had nothing to do with poisoning Navalny. But I think this will help toughen up a European view. Nord Stream, my bet here, I mean, it's a hostage to fortune, is there'll be a deal on Nord Stream. I mean, even if it's suspended for a while, it's going to get finished. The Russians are finishing it. And, there are lots of ways. Dan Fried, other people have talked about how you can apply sanctions later, written into law, if the Russians misbehave or divert gas or cut transit fees to Ukraine. Germany can invest more in energy help to Poland, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there are all kinds of ways to dodge this, but Germany's already done itself a lot of harm, both with Washington and with many of its partners in the EU, for arguing this is only a commercial deal and has no geopolitical aspects, which is clearly wrong.
Thanks, Steve. Unfortunately, that's where we will have to leave it at. One historically important and interesting footnote is that the current Secretary of State wrote his Harvard honors thesis, later publishes a book, Ally versus Ally, on the dispute between the Reagan administration and the Kohl government over the Soviet gas pipeline to Germany. He's an expert on these things, and if there is a diplomatic solution, then perhaps Tony Blinken will be the one to find it. And if he does, we will be discussing it here again on World Review, perhaps next week or one of the coming weeks. We're back here next week on Friday. Thank you all for joining. In the meantime, Steve Erlanger, Philip Stevens, Susan Glasser, thank you for joining for a terrific discussion. I wish you all a great and wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much, Ivo. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.